For at least 3 hours I've been sitting here thinking, how the f am I gonna start this video? And during that time I've already done quite a lot of work to the model that I've chosen, and that is Witchblade from CA 3D Studios, which of course means that this video was sponsored by CA 3D Studios. Now before I show you how I did what I did, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what I've actually done so far. First things first, I printed this model in 1/4 scale. Basically that means she is 1/4 the size of a real human, and she was printed on my Uniformation GK2, of which I have 2 of these. And since there were a lot of weird sized and shaped parts, it meant that I needed at least 6 build plates to print her, which took me in my studio 2 days. Now as you can tell, the model is black. That is because I've primed the model already, and I've also done a couple of other things. For example, I've already ran a cable through her entire body all the way down and out of her leg, which goes into the base. This is because in her hand she has a flame, as you can tell by the reference images, and I'm going to put an LED at the base of that frame, which is then going to help make everything light up against her body and look really cool. Another little interesting note is that the demons themselves have got green glowing eyes. Now you could probably just paint this, and in fact that would be the most easiest way, I guess, of doing this, but I'm not going to do that. So I've printed my models in clear for their heads, and I've printed their bodies in grey, which essentially means that I'm going to be putting in LEDs into their eyeballs and hoping that everything works out in the end. Now I realize that I've already done quite a lot of work to this model, but to be honest, what I've done is not actually that much. I've just put it together and put some wires in. But first, go and check out the description, because I know not many people do this, but check out the description and look at the sponsors of this video, as well as perhaps check out my website, and maybe you might be interested in the Patreon or something of the sort. And considering you're already down there, you might as well leave some words of encouragement, perhaps a like, and maybe subscribe if you haven't done that already. But more importantly, let's get some wires into this man and figure out where the wires are going to go into the base. Now, fitting a long floppy thing in a tight space is a very difficult thing to do. Just ask your mom. But if you want to know how I did it, I just shoved a stiffer thing through that space and then soldered the wire to it and drew that wire through with that. I then soldered 3mm LEDs together. These are green LEDs, and I bent them so that they were as close as possible to coming out of the eyes as I could possibly make them. I used a little bit of blue tack and some super glue to glue them in place, and then I glued the heads onto these demons. Now I obviously want the light to shine through, so I need to block that off before I do any primer layers over the top of this. One thing that I must say is that light finds a way to leak out of anything, so you need to make sure that you are sealing this properly. At this point, I'm also going to figure out where I need to make some holes in the base for the wires that are going to come out of their hands to go into. Wiring this model up does in fact mean that it cannot come apart. And now that the wiring is done, it is time for me to give the last primer coat and start working on the rest of the model. Obviously what I mean is the painting of said model. Now Witchblade, much like the darkness, has this very dark vibe to everything that isn't the character themselves. So what I'm going to do is everything needs to be dark, and I don't actually quite know how I'm going to do that. But while I'm deliberating over what colors those are going to be, I know what color this is going to be, so I can start putting the colors on this right now. Do you remember a few seconds ago when I mentioned that I knew what colors this was going to be? Well, that was an absolute lie. I have no idea what colors it's going to be, other than it needs to look like fire. So what I tend to do is just slap some colors at the piece and hope for the best. Now obviously fire is made up mostly of oranges, yellows and reds. So I'm going to start somewhere in that area by laying down some transparent oranges as well as the fluorescent orange. This is going to give the vibrance that I need, and the yellow is just going to be to add yellow because fire needs yellow. Also, I'm going to give this a clear coat with clear lacquer. This is just a cheap one from the bargain shop down the road. And now I need to start working on the base of this model, and I'm going to give it pretty much dry brushing with almost everything. Because of the amount of textures on this base, I want to draw out as much of those high edges as I possibly can. I started out with brown because I felt like this would give it a dirtier look underneath all the layers of dry brushing, and it does definitely show through, but I don't know if it was as prominent as I thought it was going to be. However, I am happy with the decisions. Also, you may have noticed I used some washes to spray over the top of it. That is to bring some blues back into these shadows, because these creatures are shadow creatures. They're meant to look like the shadows from the darkness. In the eyeballs, I had used liquid mask, obviously, to mask off the eyeballs, but obviously I didn't do that very tidily, so I had to come back in and paint it. Basically, in short, I need to repaint over the eyes where my terrible masking was, and that's what I'm gonna do right now. And the process for doing this is at first removing the liquid mask from the eyes, making sure there is absolutely none of it left over. And then I turn on the light and very carefully blind my eyeballs while I go around and paint black all around the sockets of the eyes. And by blinding my eyeballs, I genuinely mean I could only see 2 little green dots for a good hour after doing this process. The next step is then to very carefully come back in and try to get those shadows back with the airbrush, and try not to overspray too much over those eyes, but bearing in mind that the light will leak, so it's okay if there's a little bit of overspray. I then built up some highlights, and then I set about giving the saturated colors that they needed, because they couldn't just be gray. That's not very good looking. It's a boring thing to paint something gray. So to give it some colors, I decided to go with some blues, purples, and pinks. And this is going to create the shadowed effects. If you think about shadows, they are always bluey, darky, cool colors. They need to look cool because they're in the shadows. Where no sun goes, yes, that's the shadows. Also in the wings, I gave them some skin tones, but I didn't give them any undertones because I wanted them to still seem very murky and dark. And as you can see, they do come across like that. I also painted throughout their mouths and ears a little bit of fluorescent pink to try and bring some real saturated color into it that was slightly different. Then it was time for me to set up the body for its layers of skin tones, and in order to do that I need to create some volume, and creating volume, the easiest way to do that is to just spray white over the top of black. You cannot get more contrast than white and black. That is the opposite ends of the spectrum, and this is why a zenithal is white over the top of black. I wanted to get this guy stuck in place because there is wiring going through everything, so I figured I'd just glue it all together, and I've came across a little problem. It's not a big problem. I do need to check that everything still fits, but what I'm thinking of doing is gluing this dude in because he's the least obstructive of all the people. But I want to try and heat this up so that maybe I can get it to stick into that little hole if I bend it a little bit, but I'm going to heat it up first. And this is because resin is actually pliable. When you warm it up, it becomes flexible, but sometimes too flexible maybe make you cry. And that's the result of the bending. I think the bending worked, I'm going to be totally honest. His foot is in place and doesn't look weird. The gap is good. I'm happy with that. That is an acceptable gap. Now I can crack on with painting the rest of them, and I'll show you how I did that. So their eyes are going to be green when the lights are on, but if you know anything about me, you would know that once I've made something with an LED and you've seen it with the lights on, that's the last time that the lights are ever on. So I painted the eyes with a very thin layer of deck tan just so that they looked white when the lights are off, which is okay for me. You could probably add a layer of fluorescent green over the top of that. Also, you may note that I'd taken the liberty to paint deck tan over the hat, and then I used a flat red over the top of that before coming back with some colors to wash over the top of the teeth and make sure that the teeth look equally as dirty. They couldn't be too bright. I then took some Caribou Crimson and I sprayed that into certain areas around the hat to create some depth so that it looks like the hat was shaded. It then became a time that I needed to start working on the armor. And the reason that I chose to work on a hand first is because if I messed this up, it was only a hand that I needed to spray black and start again, as opposed to an entire body, which would make me very upset, and I don't want to do that. So I decided this was the best way for me to approach this part of the hand. Using some silvers, I dry brushed over the top of the hand to bring out the details, and then I used the panel line wash to go in and darken some of the deeper details, as well as I painted the little gems with a nice little layer of deck tan before using this spiritual friggin' paint from Citadel, which is essentially just glossy red. For her hair, I gave it a couple of layers of this leather brown, which is going to give me the undertones that I needed to create this reddish browny kind of, I don't know, auburn. I think that is the correct color for her hair, but don't quote me on that. Now, let's start working on the skin tones, and of course I'm going to use the classic Pinkle technique. This is the Groundeffected technique that we use Pinkle, which is a color of pink and purple mixed together. Also, you may note that instead of transparent red, I don't have any in stock. I just used red ink. It's the same thing. Well, it's not. The red ink is definitely more potent than the transparent red, but it still does a very similar job. Next step is to layer up all the basic skin tones, making sure to obviously leave over some of that lovely pinkle in the undertones of these particular skin tones. After that, I need to add a little bit of a highlight to that. Also, in this particular video, I'm going to give you another option for the color that's supposed to come after this. And the color that comes after doing the highlights, once you've made sure they're all in the right place, is going to be Orcish Dermis, which I absolutely love this color. However, apparently it's never in stock for a lot of people, or they just can't get those brands. So another way you can remake this using brands that you may actually be able to find is using this rosy flesh and red ink, both from Vallejo, mixed together to a certain ratio, will give you kind of orcish flesh. It's not the same. I'm gonna be totally honest with you. It's not exactly the same, but if you look at my picture, it's kind of close, and it does do the job of Orcish Dermis. Now, I normally have been skipping this step in a couple of my previous projects, but I decided to add a thin layer of yellow over the top of this one. I don't know why. Don't even ask. And now that the skin tones are all down, it's easy for me to come back in and just block up all the rest of the armor that is across the body. And I'm going to do this using a Citadel Black because it's a contrast paint. It's wet, it's thin, it's easy to dip my brush into the pot, take it out, rather than mixing up a whole load of black and putting it in water. This stuff works. It's not an exact black that I prefer. I don't really know how to explain this, but I prefer matte black from Vallejo over this color. However, the matte black does mean that I have to use it and mix it on my palette, and I did not enjoy doing that at this time, so I thought it would be quicker to just do it this way. Dip it in the pot, stick it on the model, thank your mother later. Now, while I wait for that black to dry enough for me to be able to hold the model and carry on painting it, I'm gonna return to the hair and add a little bit of some shadow and how you say je ne sais quoi by adding this ink that's called skin color. It's just a slightly redder brown essentially, and when that dries I need to move over to another job, and that's going to be dry brushing all of the armor that's on this body. That was obviously a lot longer than what it appeared in the video, but never mind that. Movie magic is a fantastic thing. Also, at this point, I'm going to add the rest of the cables into the model, and again, if you remember, this means it cannot come apart, which is not a good thing if you ever want to move it, but it is just, is what it is. I wanted LEDs to be in it, and that's where we're at. Now, taking Magos Purple, I'm going to try something a little bit different. I painted the lips, that's not different, but I painted the eyes first with Magos Purple instead of painting black. Now taking this grayish kind of bluey gray color, which is a contrast paint, watering it down and spraying it into the eyeshadow, this gives me the look of makeup. I also used a little bit of pink as a blush on the lips, and I also used a brighter skin tone just on the lower eyelid to try and make that stand out a little bit more. Then taking a little bit of that same contrast black, which is Black Templar, I painted that over the top eyelid, well, essentially what is actually the eyelashes of the model. I also then took some deck tan and painted the teeth, or tooth, because it is one big tooth, just in the middle of her lips. And then I also painted the shapes of her eyes, keeping some of that red particularly around the bottom of the eye, and going quite close to the black on the top of the eye. Using a nice dark brown, I'm going to paint in her eyebrows. And I'm going to use brushstroke method for this in regards to how it looks. That means I'm just kind of making it look like there is brush strokes in the eyebrows. They don't have to be too perfect, but you do want brush strokes in there. I'm going to dry brush also the hair, and what you didn't see is that I sprayed a wash to get rid of the powdery look. Now working on the eyes, I severely regret what I did with this model. I wanted these eyes to be a whole lot bigger. This is the size that I ended up doing them, and annoyingly that's the size that I should have just made the pupils, and the rest of the eye should have been so much bigger, but it is what it is. After I've added the pupil in the middle of the iris, it dawned on me that it was too small, and it's too late now because I just don't have the time to go back and do it. I added a highlight to those eyes, and that's pretty much where I decided to call this model done. I made a couple of mistakes making this model. To be totally honest, I make a lot of mistakes when I make all my models, and in this video I guess I pointed out a lot more of them than I usually would. However, I do feel like in the future I will try to point out as much as possible where I've made mistakes, so that you might be able to see the same things that I'm seeing. At the end of the day though, I do just want to say thank you so much for watching my video. Of course, it might have just been an entertaining time while you're on the toilet, or it could have been a way to get out of doing chores at home. And if it was, then it is my pleasure. And now also I would like to say a very special thank you to those who keep the lights on and blinding my eyeballs, and that is going to be the Patreons. Because of course, without their support, it makes it really difficult to do the job that I currently do. Everybody that did watch this video indeed gets a thank you, and if you didn't like anything that you saw, then I don't actually care. Also, go check out in the link in the description for the sponsor, CA 3D Studios. Good models, good stuff, and cool.